The testimony of Dostoevsky is among the most beautiful strokes of fortune in my life. Friedrich Nietzsche and Fyodor Dostoevsky are two thinkers that, for many, define the 19th century. They are two geniuses emblematic of the kind of questions that many were grappling with during this time period. The decline of religion, the impact of the Enlightenment, industrialization, and the rise of competing political ideologies were overturning the truths that many held to be self-evident. And few thinkers tackled these with as much detail and enthusiasm as Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. Whenever one of them is mentioned in a conversation, the other is never far behind. And this totally makes sense because they tackle many of the same questions, but from radically different perspectives. Whereas Dostoevsky is a universalist, Nietzsche is an unashamed elitist. While Nietzsche is a radical, Dostoevsky is, in many ways, philosophically conservative. And this makes it fascinating to see where these great minds agree, and, more importantly, where they differ. So for this video, we will examine a few key philosophical areas, religion, morality, and more, to find out how these phenomenal minds would clash in an imaginary debate. Get ready to learn why Dostoevsky would consider Nietzsche incredibly dangerous, how Nietzsche would reject the core thesis of crime and punishment, and how two geniuses can disagree almost completely about the subject of ethics itself. As always, bear in mind that this is just my incomplete interpretation of these thinkers. And since we're covering so many areas so quickly, I will be skimming over some of the details of their thought. But, to begin, let's examine the foundational issue that underpins the philosophies of both of these men. Their ideas about God and meaning. 1. The divine tragedy. God is dead and we have killed him. Nietzsche's famous line from The Gay Science has gone down in history. And the paragraph that contains this pithy phrase does give a fair overview of Nietzsche's more theological ideas. Nietzsche was both deeply concerned but quietly excited about the slow decline of religion in 19th century Europe. On the one hand, he was deeply critical of Christianity and Christian ethics, seeing it as weakening our instincts and turning us into passive bystanders in our own lives, happy to wait this life out in the promise of heavenly reward. But at the same time, he recognized that for a great many people, God was what gave their existence meaning. It allowed them to cope with terrible hardship by saying, this life may be tough, dreary, and painful, but it is just the overture to everlasting bliss. It gave martyrs the strength to resist terrible suffering and provided people with a reason to act. Sure, he thought it was a deeply flawed reason to act, fit only for the weak, but beggars can't be choosers. Nietzsche envisions that, without God, there's a serious risk many of us will turn into passive nihilists. We will lose the motivation to act almost entirely, and will either pursue the path of least resistance until we fall lazily into our graves, or we will cease to engage with life at all, becoming more rock than person. And it is this pessimistic side of Nietzsche's proclamation that he shares with Dostoevsky. The great Russian was deeply concerned with the gradual decline of Orthodox Christianity in his homeland. Dostoevsky had served in a Siberian labor camp for 4 years, as punishment for being part of a conspiratorial circle in St. Petersburg. And this experience was integral in shaping his worldview. Here, he became convinced of the ability religion had to give strength and joy in even the direst of circumstances. In the wild west of Tsarist prison, Christ became the last line of defense against total, unmitigated chaos and cruelty. Now, I want to be careful here, because Dostoevsky's views on God are often caricatured. He is actually very critical of the way many people use religion to enrich themselves or to manipulate others. In fact, he accuses the Catholic Church of doing just that. But he also venerates Jesus Christ as someone who is able to give universal love, humility, and compassion. And he is wed to this ideal for his entire later life. In contrast to Nietzsche, he is deeply optimistic about what Christianity could be. And specifically, he has confidence in the humble faith of the Russian peasantry. Put a pin in this idea, as it will be very important for the rest of the video. This broadly positive view of Christianity meant Dostoevsky had a dark vision of what Europe and Russia could become without these Christ-like ideals. He does not necessarily envision total anarchy, but rather a cold, utilitarian way of viewing our fellow man. He thinks that without Christ, there's a risk we will let go of this idea that people have innate value. and instead we will start to see them as numbers on a spreadsheet that can be sacrificed if need be. This was just one of the criticisms that he leveled at contemporary socialist thinkers. He saw them as willing to throw the Russian peasantry on a funeral pyre in order to achieve their aims. There are also various characters in his stories that embody the kind of passive nihilist that Nietzsche was worried about. These figures either become completely uninterested in life, eventually taking their own lives, or they nurse a general hatred towards other people. For Dostoevsky, they are robbed of higher meaning and thus of human dignity. They become a bit like animals, never thinking ahead of their next meal, and never aspiring to anything greater or more fulfilling than simple sustenance. Of course, this is just one characterization that Dostoevsky gives to nihilists, and there are so many I can't possibly go into them all here. However, this fear of nihilism is where the similarities end in Dostoevsky and Nietzsche's view of religion. Because Nietzsche ultimately still thinks of Christianity itself as a doctrine of weakness, passivity, and envy. In fact, he sees it as laying the groundwork for nihilism to take over later. But for Dostoevsky, it has the potential to teach us to be strong and active, yet also compassionate, selfless, and loving. This disagreement is also apparent in Nietzsche's ideal scenario in a post-religious world. In the wake of nihilism, he wants there to be new philosophers who will be able to construct brand new values and reasons to live merely from the strength of their wills. He does not give a detailed account of what these new systems will be like, preferring instead to leave it to later thinkers. But from what he does say, it is clear that these new values will prioritize power, egoism, and strength. It will scorn pity, hate the weak, and despise any idea of a next life. People will be taught to embrace this material world wholeheartedly, but in a way that is far less inherently compassionate than Dostoevsky's vision for the future of the planet. While Dostoevsky also wants us to love life and encourage others to do the same, the order of priorities is deeply important. Nietzsche wants us to start with our own power and egoism, and then build out to loving life and possibly loving other people from here. But Dostoevsky wants us to find our fulfillment in the service and active love of others. Ultimately, they both think that their paths will lead to personal joy. But whereas Nietzsche would admire a conqueror for their personal power, Dostoevsky would instead praise a charity worker for their generosity towards others, even if they themselves have very little power at all. So, in a couple of sentences, whereas Nietzsche sees Christianity as passive and weak, Dostoevsky sees it as active and loving. And while Nietzsche wants to move past Christianity altogether, Dostoevsky wants to use the ideals of that religion and the figure of Jesus Christ to teach people to live more compassionate and fulfilled lives. And this profound difference in ideas comes out very strongly in how Nietzsche and Dostoevsky view the relative value of people. This is an incredibly juicy and controversial topic, and it is just what we're going to move on to next. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to either my channel or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. Equality and the Ubermensch. While outright fascists have mischaracterized and misappropriated Nietzsche in a whole host of ways, there is one property that they genuinely do share. Nietzsche was avowedly anti-egalitarian. He viewed the idea that people were equally valuable as completely ridiculous and focused entirely on what he saw as the best people from every civilization. He did not think that this hierarchy was racial or ethnic, but nonetheless, he held views that are vastly out of step with the generally humanistic ideas that many of us hold today. This theme of elitism is most prominent in Nietzsche's core idea of the Ubermensch. This is someone who, essentially, has managed to transcend their humanity and become radically free. They do this in 3 stages, and I'll skim over each of them here. The first stage is called the camel and consists of learning to take joy in suffering and discomfort. The camel will happily bear the weight of challenge upon their shoulders and even rejoice in it, asking for more. The next stage is the lion. For Nietzsche, this is someone who has seen through the weakness of our current moral system and who takes joy in destroying it. They see themselves as above judgment. They reject moral statements and exist beyond good and evil, but they have not yet learned to be creative. Lastly, we have the child. This is the person who not only rejects the values of the past, but is so free of them that they can create their own new values entirely from their wills, just like we were saying in the last section. They engage with the world with the rediscovered innocence they had as a toddler, viewing it like a playground. This is the kind of Ubermensch that Nietzsche ultimately admires and hopes to bring about. And quite frankly, he could not care what happens to the rest of us as long as this is achieved. In fact, at points he says it is our job as lesser people to work towards the coming of this Ubermensch. And Nietzsche's elitism stretches to how he views the success or failure of entire societies. In his view, a great society is one that spawns a high number of great people. He does not really mind how they would treat mere unexceptional people, how we would suffer. This is the underlying logic for his criticisms of a whole host of ethical systems like Christianity and utilitarianism. All this talk of the greatest good for the greatest number and the meek shall inherit the earth and everyone is made in the image of God strikes him as antithetical to the world he wants to create. In his view, it is encouraging mediocrity and holding back those of us that are truly special. For him, the weak do not deserve pity, and it would be cruel of us to give it to them anyway. He wants to see them become strong and exceptional, so we can have one more strong and exceptional person in our society. And if they can't, then he simply does not care about them. On the whole, Nietzsche thinks it will only ever be a tiny minority of us that can ever become these exceptional people, even if, in the right context, we could all theoretically achieve this goal. But either way, Nietzsche's elitism is thoroughgoing, unequivocal, and is strung through his entire philosophy. He says weak people need religion to survive, and the strong don't. Some people are worth thinking about, and others are not. Some of us can rise above morality, but others are too feeble to break free of its grasp. The contrast with Dostoevsky here is palpable. They are almost at opposite ends of the spectrum. In some ways, Crime and Punishment is one big preemptive criticism of elitist ideas like Nietzsche's. Okay, there are going to be some spoilers in the next couple of sentences, but skip to here if you want to miss them. In the novel, our protagonist, Raskolnikov, has a very similar idea to Nietzsche. He thinks there are some people who are extraordinary, and that these elevated souls will be able to ignore morality and instead assert their own individual will on the world. Just like Nietzsche, he even uses Napoleon as a prime example of such a man. With this in mind, he sets out to murder an old pawnbroker. But as soon as he does, his guilt and shame hit him like a troika. He is tortured out of his skull as he cannot help but condemn himself for his actions. Eventually, he breaks down and confesses his crimes because in his view, the promise of repentance through punishment in Siberia was still less awful than the prospect of this inner suffering haunting him for the rest of his days. In Dostoevsky's view, there is no running from our conscience, and no one is truly above morality. If they were, this would not be a sign of their superiority, but rather their severe mental sickness. And this egalitarian spirit is consistent with the rest of Dostoevsky's philosophy. Whereas Nietzsche harbored a deep contempt for the powerless, for a long time Dostoevsky considered himself their champion. In his youth, he argued for the abolition of serfdom, the system of feudal slavery that dominated Russia. And at points, his worldview bordered on socialist. After his release from Siberian prison, his outlook changed. He did become avowedly anti-socialist. But this does not mean that he lost his compassion for the downtrodden. On the contrary, he became a sort of Christian universalist. He dreamed of a world where people would hold selfless love for one another and would forge a universal brotherhood. This was the closest he thought we could come to building heaven on earth, and it became an increasingly prominent theme in his later writings. In the modern day, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky are often lumped together as anti-socialist and anti-utilitarian thinkers. And it is true that they were both opponents of socialism and utilitarianism, but the bases of their opposition were very different. Nietzsche disagreed with them because of their egalitarian premises. He thought that some people were just better than others, and that these ideologies both obscured this fact and kept potentially exceptional people from fulfilling that potential. But Dostoevsky did not take issue with the egalitarian component of socialism or utilitarianism. He just saw them, practically speaking, as self-serving ideologies that were often used by the Russian educated class to undermine the way of life of the peasantry. And he thought that the only true and sustainable egalitarianism must be founded on universal Christian love, rather than on cold economics or an ethical system that thought happiness was the goal of all human life. Sure, at a low resolution, they are both disagreeing, but we must not be fooled into thinking they are coming from the same place. As I said at the beginning, Nietzsche is an elitist, whereas Dostoevsky is a universalist who thinks we are all made in the image of God. In fact, Nietzsche would probably view Dostoevsky's compassion-based philosophy as a prime example of slave morality. He absolutely despised the sort of universalism that Dostoevsky preached. And the conflict between these two thinkers runs far deeper than this, because in the end, they disagree about the fundamental building blocks of human psychology and what it takes to make a person fulfilled. 3. Resentment and power. Nietzsche once said that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist who had anything to teach him. There is a clear sense of respect here for the Russian author's penetrating insight into the human mind. At the same time, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky have wildly different views of personal psychology. However, let's start where they do agree: their shared condemnation of resentment. One of Dostoevsky's books that we are pretty certain Nietzsche read was the French version of Notes from the Underground, where Dostoevsky paints a portrait of a man entirely consumed with resentment, unable to take any sort of revenge, yet also unable to let go of the perceived injustices committed to him. The underground man stews in a pit of his own loathing. He comes to hate both himself for his own impotence and everyone else for what they have done to him. He is truly weak, both physically and psychologically. And since he cannot assert his will in this actual world, he takes a mental revenge on everyone else by being a nuisance in whatever small way he can, and by convincing himself that he is a misunderstood and profound intellect that other people are just too stupid to appreciate. We can immediately see the similarities this novella has to Nietzsche's own theory of resentment. I constantly go on about resentment in my videos, so I'm going to keep this brief. Essentially, for Nietzsche, when someone's desires are unachievable, they often react by demonizing whatever they previously wanted, calling those that have it evil, and thus taking a philosophical revenge on the people that have what they want. Nietzsche thought that this was the entire basis for Christian ethics. For him, the idea that we should be humble servants of God rather than masters of the physical world was created by powerless people devaluing actual power because they could not achieve it. This was another of his philosophical assaults on Christianity. He viewed it as fundamentally dishonest and built on resentment. And apart from the stuff about Christianity, there is some real crossover with Dostoevsky's views here. In both cases, resentment stems from a form of frustrated desire, which is then transformed into a wild attack on other people, as well as a profound inner suffering and an irrational wish for self-destruction. However, they disagree intensely about what the solution to this resentment should be. For Dostoevsky, resentment often stems from a genuine lack in our physical, social, or philosophical needs. At the physical level, if we are deprived of basic things like enough food to be satisfied and enough security to feel safe, then we will inevitably become on edge, angry, and resentful. This view partly stems from Dostoevsky's time in Siberia, where he saw violence erupt seemingly at random, partly due to the chaotic and cruel conditions people were kept in. At the social level, we want to be recognized as having dignity and value by other people. A huge component of the underground man's resentment comes from the lack of respect he sees given to him by his so-called friends and those in wider society. He has been deprived of his social dignity and, unsurprisingly, lashes out as a result. We see the same lack of respect drive characters from his other novels to acts of self-destruction and self-loathing. A good example of this is Grushenka from The Brothers Karamazov or Nastasia Filipovna from The Idiot. Lastly, Dostoevsky is adamant that we must have our spiritual, existential, and philosophical needs fulfilled. His views are immensely complicated here, and if I go into detail, this video will end up 5 hours long. But essentially, he thinks we need to feel free, we need to think that our lives have value, and we need to feel like we can love other people. This is one reason why he describes hell as the inability to love, and why the underground man says that even in a utopia, he would feel the need to do something self-destructive and resentful, just to assert his radical freedom on a perfect but unfree world. For Dostoevsky, even if our physical and social needs are met, if we are philosophically lacking, then this can drive us to despair. And this is all in marked contrast to Nietzsche's ideas about mankind. For Nietzsche, the ultimate human drive is the will to power. This is, again, a complicated subject, but in essence, he thinks that what humans tend to strive towards is the ability to enforce their will on the world and on themselves. This can take the form of conquering and dominating others, as in the case of Napoleon or Cesare Borgia. But the will to power can also be expressed in revolutionary philosophy and art, like in the case of Johann Goethe or Plato. Importantly, Nietzsche thinks that the origins of resentment are not the same thwarted philosophical needs that Dostoevsky focuses on, but instead it all stems from a frustrated will to power. So for Nietzsche, the answer is simple. Gain more power, strengthen your will, and your resentment will be conquered. Alternatively, you can attempt to overcome your resentment directly, taking that as the object of your will to power. But this will take enormous reserves of inner strength that most people don't have. This was one thing that made the person of Jesus so exceptional in Nietzsche's eyes, despite his broad critiques of Christianity. Jesus seemed able to reject resentment even in situations where he had only a minuscule amount of physical power, even forgiving the people who were in the process of nailing him to a cross. However, Dostoevsky would intensely disagree with this emphasis on power. There are numerous characters in his novels that do not lack for power or influence, but at the same time eventually come up against something that they cannot overcome with this, and moreover could not, even in principle, overcome with further power. Ivan Karamazov is a hair's breadth away from achieving everything he desires, but is haunted by guilt and shame and eventually falls into a kind of madness. Svidrigailov from Crime and Punishment is rich, influential, and has everything he could want, but he lacks for love and meaning, and so all of his power and wealth amounts to nothing, and he eventually takes his own life. While both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky agree that resentment is the root cause of a lot of human misery, their solutions could not be more opposed. Nietzsche recommends egoistic power, whereas Dostoevsky wants us to fulfill our philosophical needs via God and the love of others. It is a mirror of what we were saying in the first section. Nietzsche starts with what we can do for us, but Dostoevsky places much more emphasis on serving other people. And he would consider the kind of egoistic approach that Nietzsche recommends as paving the road to despair. But what, ultimately, can we learn from these two thinkers about what it means to be human? And why should we continue to value their thoughts and insights today? Well, my imaginary interlocutor, I'm glad you asked. 4. The Optimist and the Cynic. As I said at the beginning, Dostoevsky and Nietzsche are a notable pair because they examine many of the same issues but from radically different viewpoints. And a lot of this comes down to their different stances on human nature. If I was to put it overwhelmingly crudely in a single sentence, they are both often disillusioned with how people act today. But whereas Dostoevsky is an optimist, Nietzsche borders on cynicism, at least for everyone apart from his few exceptional people. To understand Dostoevsky's views on human nature, it's important to realize that he spent huge portions of his life in wildly different parts of Russian society. He was born a minor member of the new nobility, qualified as an engineer, joined intellectual circles, served a long stint in a prison camp, was a conscript in the army, and then, towards the end of his life, met with the Tsar of Russia and was considered a kind of prophet. In his time, he dined with peasants and kings, professors and prisoners, and this informed how he saw humanity itself. He was acutely aware of just how selfish and cruel humans can be, and how this could cascade outwards into cycles of violence. It is said that as a young man, he saw a military officer beat a driver, who then beat his horse, and this informed his ideas about how brutality can spread through a group of people. He was also in awe of humanity's ability to show true humility and kindness in the direst of situations. There was the doctor at his prison camp who did all he could to help the prisoners stay looked after, the women of the local village who sent aid to the exiles, and even the prisoners themselves, who could often be callous and vindictive, would become humble and kind when they were presented with religious symbols and ceremonies. Dostoevsky became adept at seeing the nuggets of goodness within tortured souls, as well as the selfishness and avarice that pervaded the so-called great and good. All of this meshed very well with Dostoevsky's Orthodox Christian views. In his mind, humans are fallen creatures, but with little specks of the divine in them, that are to be nurtured and grown through active love. On the one hand, there is no one who is beyond redemption, but on the other, there is no one who is truly perfect either. Dostoevsky's hope was that the example of Jesus Christ, someone who was selflessly loving, free from resentment, and without ego, would inspire us to follow in his footsteps and become not just Christian in the everyday sense, but actively Christ-like. This was the strongest chance of achieving his dream of universal brotherhood. By contrast, Nietzsche's views on humanity were much less idealistic. He saw us as fundamentally power-seeking beings who were prone to cruelty and had a real propensity towards laziness and resentment. And for those of us that do not become powerful Ubermenschen, this is exactly where he thinks we will remain. In his notebooks, he says the majority of people have disorganized wills, which prevent them from developing. And he conceived of his philosophy as only being for the few who could understand and make use of it. In the majority of cases, Nietzsche thinks very, very little of human nature. But for the lucky few that can transcend this, Nietzsche foresees great things. Unlike Dostoevsky, who will always hold God to be above mankind, Nietzsche thinks that a few of us can ascend beyond the all-too-human to a kind of quasi-godhood, where we can legislate our values from on high and not concern ourselves with the wants, wishes, and judgments of the petty people who pass below us. This is far beyond what Dostoevsky thinks humanity can, and indeed should, do. Whereas Dostoevsky sees all of us as in need of redemption, Nietzsche envisions a few people with basically unlimited potential. But his idea of what these few exceptional people should do is incredibly controversial, and for many borders on cynicism. After all, how many of us would consider the ability to become an elite philosophical overclass truly an optimistic view of humankind? Regardless of whether you think Nietzsche is speaking of a political overclass or just an existential one, isn't this a bit bleak? Is this idea of humanity as fundamentally power-seeking actually realistic? Or is it overly pessimistic? Is the endless potential Nietzsche sees in us really the direction we would like to go? Or is it instead just the glorification of our worst impulses? On the other hand, we might think Dostoevsky is basically a dreamer, that this idea he has of universal brotherly love is completely idealistic. Nietzsche would certainly criticize it for restricting the egoistic desires of the truly powerful, and would see it as inevitably stemming from resentment. If Nietzsche might run the risk of overt cynicism, is Dostoevsky guilty of seeing too much potential goodness in us? Take the underground man, for example. Does Dostoevsky really think that he is capable of learning a universal active love? Or Svidrigailov, who abuses children and murders innocents in pursuit of his own hedonistic pleasure? Can this man really be redeemed, transformed into the model of kindness and compassion? Dostoevsky thinks that, in theory, yes. If these people truly opened their hearts to loving both God and their fellow man, then they would become happier and, moreover, better. But do we agree? Are there some people who are beyond saving? Additionally, is Orthodox Christianity the only or even preferable way to do this? Ultimately, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's disagreements on many topics are reflected in this difference they have about human nature. For Dostoevsky, everyone is deeply flawed, but we also have a spark of divinity that is worth cherishing, and everyone is made valuable by this. Whereas for Nietzsche, most people are quietly mediocre and fundamentally beneath his consideration. But for the happy few Ubermensch and his new philosophers, he sees a kind of glory that Dostoevsky would reserve only for Christ himself. Their differences about politics, ethics, psychology, and more all find a large part of their origin in this disagreement about mankind. Are we in need of redemption, or are we capable of transcending ourselves through egoistic power? Are we defined by the few of us who are exceptional, or do we all have innate worth? Can we transcend morality and shape it into what we please, or must we listen to the nagging voice of our conscience? Is there hope that all of us might become better and greater people, or are most of us already condemned to mediocrity? Can we become gods, or is it immense hubris to even consider this idea? What are the philosophical needs of humankind, and how will we achieve them? These are the sorts of fundamental questions that arise when we discuss Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's philosophies in tandem. And in my opinion, reading them together transcends comparative academic exercise and can be a great starting point for crafting our own existential ideas. But if nothing else, I hope this video has whetted your appetite and encouraged you to look further into the minds of these magnificent philosophers. Each of them is a treasure trove well worth exploring. And if you want to do so immediately, then check out my Dostoevsky playlist right here. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.